The night air was heavy, silence broken only by a mother's scream as Sarah clutched Ethan in the dim apartment doorway. Daniel turned with fury in his eyes, his words venomous and sharp. Sarah said, "Please, don't do this. He doesn't deserve to see us torn apart like this." Daniel's face twisted in rage as he stormed past, slamming the door so hard, the walls rattled. Ethan buried his face in her chest, trembling. Sirens echoed faintly outside, a grim reminder of chaos creeping closer. The narrator's voice carried the weight of inevitability. This moment was the breaking point, the one where everything Sarah had sacrificed to protect her child seemed to collapse in an instant. Fear coursed through her veins, but beneath it lay a fragile resolve that whispered she would not surrender. The silence after the slam was suffocating. Sarah stood motionless, listening to faint sirens outside. Ethan whispered, "Mom, is he coming back?" His small voice cracked, filling the room with dread. Sarah forced a smile, though her heart was fractured. She said, "No, sweetheart, we're safe now." The narrator explained how Sarah's mind raced, replaying the scene like a cruel echo. She wanted to believe her words, but doubt gnawed at her chest. She sank onto the couch, pulling Ethan close, the weight of the moment pressing into her bones. This was no longer about survival. It was about proving to herself she could stand firm. In that instant, Sarah knew the real fight was only beginning. The narrator revealed Sarah hadn't felt this fear since Daniel first left years ago. Back then she believed wounds could heal, but tonight reopened every scar. Ethan whispered, "Mom, why was Dad so angry?" Sarah kissed his head and said, "Sometimes people lose their way, but it's not your fault." The words burned her throat, half meant for him, half for herself. Memories of Daniel's broken promises resurfaced, each one heavier than the last. The apartment felt smaller, air thicker, shadows pressing against her. Sarah realized she wasn't trapped by the room but by echoes of choices that haunted her. The night dragged on, the ticking clock louder with every second. Sarah walked to the window, pulling blinds apart just enough to peek outside. The street was quiet, though her nerves screamed louder than silence. Ethan had fallen asleep on the couch, his small chest rising like fragile hope. Sarah whispered, "I won't let him hurt us again." Her reflection stared back, a woman barely recognizable, pale and worn, yet eyes burning with resolve. The narrator explained this was the moment Sarah shifted from victim to protector, planting the first seed of strength for the battles ahead. Sarah returned to the couch and knelt beside Ethan, brushing hair from his forehead as he slept. She whispered, "You're my reason, Ethan. You're why I keep fighting." The narrator described her tears not as weakness but release, storm within anchored by his breathing. For every betrayal and sleepless night, this boy was her redemption. She kissed his temple, and her trembling eased. The world outside was uncertain, but inside the apartment, a promise was forged. No matter what battles lay ahead, Sarah would not falter. She had chosen her path, sacrifice for strength and love for survival. Morning light crept into the apartment, painting walls with pale gold. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, head in her hands, while Ethan stirred cereal in silence. The narrator explained how the weight of the night lingered like an invisible fog. "Us?" Ethan asked softly. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" Sarah lifted her face, eyes weary but determined, and said, "Yes, we will, because we have each other." Her voice cracked, yet it carried a fragile conviction. Every choice she made now was no longer just about survival, but about proving that they could rebuild. The sound of the spoon clinking in the bowl was a haunting rhythm of uncertainty. Sarah's heart ached, but in her son's eyes she saw the strength she needed. Later that day, Sarah walked Ethan to school, her hand gripping his tightly as if letting go meant losing everything. The narrator described how every step felt heavier, each parent's glance at the gate a reminder of the life she fought to provide. Ethan said, "Mom, I don't want you to worry about me." She smiled faintly, replying, "I'll always worry, that's my job." The school bell rang, echoing against her ribs like a warning bell for the battles ahead. She watched Ethan disappear into the crowd, her chest tightening with pride and fear. Alone on the sidewalk, Sarah breathed deeply, bracing herself to face the world without him by her side. At work, Sarah sat behind her desk, staring at a mountain of files, her mind elsewhere. The narrator noted how she struggled to balance her job's demands with the storm consuming her home. Her coworker Lisa leaned over, whispering, "Rough night." Sarah forced a smile and said, "You could say that." Behind her eyes was exhaustion she dared not show. The hum of printers and ringing phones surrounded her, yet she felt isolated, like the walls were closing in. Every task became a test of endurance. She thought of Ethan, her anchor, and reminded herself that this paycheck was the thread holding their fragile life together. Evening returned Sarah to her apartment, where silence waited like an unwelcome guest. Ethan worked on homework at the table, his small brow furrowed in concentration. Sarah sat across from him, trying to focus but consumed by the memory of Daniel's rage. The narrator described her unease, the sense that the storm was far from over. Ethan looked up and said, "Mom, I got this one right." His innocent pride pierced her heart with warmth. Sarah smiled, whispering, "I knew you would." That moment reminded her that even in the darkest nights, light flickered in small victories. The apartment felt less like a cage and more like a shelter, if only for a heartbeat. That night, Sarah lay awake in bed, the ceiling above painted with shifting streetlight shadows. The narrator explained how her thoughts spiraled between fear of Daniel's return and hope for Ethan's future. She whispered into the quiet, "I won't let him break us." The words were both vow and prayer. Memories of sacrifice washed over her, every job she had worked, every tear she had swallowed alone. For the first time she admitted the truth, she was terrified. Yet alongside fear was defiance, the flicker of a flame refusing to die. As sleep finally pulled her under, Sarah knew tomorrow would demand more strength, but tonight she had claimed resolve. The letter sat unopened on the table, its presence like a storm cloud. Sarah stared at it, her hands trembling as Ethan played quietly with his toy nearby. The narrator explained how fear had a way of announcing itself before truth even arrived. Sarah tore the envelope open and her heart sank as she read Daniel's demand for custody. The words blurred as tears welled, each sentence a blade cutting deeper. Ethan looked up and asked, "Mom, is something wrong?" Forcing a smile, Sarah replied, "No, sweetheart, just some papers." Her voice shook, betraying her. The reality was clear. Daniel wasn't done, and now the battle would move beyond slammed doors into a courtroom war. The following day, Sarah met with her best friend Rachel at a cafe, her voice low as she explained the custody papers. Rachel frowned, saying, "He's trying to break you, but you're stronger than this." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "What if I lose him?" The narrator described how the cafe's warmth contrasted with the storm inside her chest. Rachel reached across the table, squeezing Sarah's hand with quiet certainty. She said, "You've fought harder battles. You'll fight this one too." For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to believe it, clinging to her friend's unwavering loyalty like a lifeline. Later that week, Sarah returned home to find her paycheck short, her boss having cut her hours without warning. The narrator revealed how betrayal seemed to come from every side. She called her boss, voice steady despite the rage inside, only to hear dismissive excuses. Hanging up, she slammed the phone onto the counter. Ethan peeked from the hallway, whispering, "Mom, are we okay?" Sarah pulled him close and said, "We'll figure it out, I promise." Yet her chest tightened with doubt. Money was slipping through her fingers, just when she needed it most. The walls of survival were closing in. One evening, Sarah received a call from Rachel, her tone hesitant. She confessed that she had known Daniel was planning legal action but hadn't told Sarah out of fear of making things worse. Sarah's heart cracked, betrayal striking from the person she trusted most. "You should have told me," Sarah said, her voice trembling with hurt. Rachel stammered apologies, but the wound had been made. The narrator described Sarah's loneliness deepening, trust eroding even among allies. She hung up, her hands shaking, eyes burning. In that moment, Sarah realized she stood nearly alone. the circle around her shrinking with every passing day. That night, Sarah sat at the table with stacks of unpaid bills, her head resting in her hands. The narrator explained how exhaustion gnawed at her spirit, yet the sight of Ethan's drawings pinned to the fridge gave her strength. She whispered to herself, "I can't fall apart, not now." Ethan padded into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, and said, "Mom, I had a bad dream." She lifted him into her lap, holding him tightly. For a moment the world fell away, and all that remained was the bond between them. In that fragile embrace she found courage, a fragile flame refusing to die. Sarah sat alone on the couch late at night, the hum of the refrigerator her only company. She held a faded photograph of herself and Daniel in happier times, her fingers trembling as she traced the edges. The narrator explained how memories attacked when silence fell, dragging her back to a life that felt like someone else. Ethan stirred in his sleep, his soft voice calling, "Mom." Sarah wiped her tears quickly, whispering, "I'm here, sweetheart, always." Her heart split between the guilt of past choices and the need to protect his innocence. Every scar she carried seemed to bleed again, reminding her of mistakes she wished she could bury. The next morning, Sarah stood before a stern social worker in her cramped living room, papers scattered across the table. The narrator described the heavy silence as every detail of her home was examined. The social worker asked, "Do you feel you're able to provide a stable environment for your son?" Sarah forced confidence into her voice and replied, "Yes, I've done it all his life, and I'll keep doing it." Yet her hands clenched tightly behind her back, betraying her fear. Each question felt like a judgment, not only of her parenting but of her worth as a mother. That night Sarah dreamt of her childhood home, the narrator revealing that memories had a way of bleeding into the present. She saw her late mother's face, a reminder of love and loss, and heard her say, "You are stronger than you believe." Sarah awoke with tears in her eyes, the memory both comforting and cruel. She whispered into the dark, "I miss you." The shadows on the ceiling seemed to press down heavier than before. She turned to look at Ethan sleeping peacefully, realizing her mother's words had been passed down through her love for him. A week later, Sarah sat outside the courthouse, clutching Ethan's backpack like a shield. The narrator described how the cold stone steps beneath her felt like the weight of judgment already pressing down. Daniel appeared across the plaza with his lawyer, his smirk slicing into her resolve. He said loudly, "You're not ready for this fight." Sarah met his gaze and whispered to herself, "Yes, I am." Fear pulsed through her, but beneath it was defiance. She tightened her grip on the backpack, her knuckles pale, refusing to let intimidation win. That evening, Sarah collapsed onto her bed, exhaustion flooding every bone. The narrator explained that her strength felt brittle, her body moving only from sheer necessity. She whispered, "I can't keep breaking like this," her voice cracking into the silence. Yet as her eyes closed, Ethan crept into the room, climbing onto the bed beside her. He laid his head on her arm and whispered, "I love you, Mom." Her tears flowed freely, not of despair, but of fragile hope. In that small gesture, Sarah felt a spark of strength returning, reminding her that even in her lowest moment, she was not alone. Rain poured outside as Sarah sat by the window, her reflection fractured by raindrops. A knock startled her, and when she opened the door, an unfamiliar face stood there. The narrator explained how she froze, recognizing a stranger yet seeing shadows of family in his eyes. The man introduced himself as David, her estranged brother. His voice trembled as he said, "I've been watching from a distance, waiting for the right time." Sarah's heart pounded, torn between anger and longing. Years of abandonment screamed at her, but the storm outside felt quieter than the one inside. They sat at the table, silence stretching as Sarah's eyes studied David. He finally said, "I know I should have come sooner, but I thought I could protect you better from afar." Her jaw tightened as she whispered, "Protect me by disappearing?" The narrator revealed how every word scraped open old wounds. David leaned forward, his eyes filled with regret. "I can help you now, but it comes with truths you might not want to hear." Sarah's pulse quickened. For the first time in years, she felt the past demanding to be faced rather than buried. David unfolded a worn envelope and slid it across the table. Sarah's hands shook as she opened it, reading documents that revealed Daniel's financial manipulation stretching back years. The narrator explained how betrayal rooted itself deeper, more insidious than she imagined. Sarah's voice cracked. "You knew this all along?" David lowered his gaze, shame carved into his features. He replied, "I tried to stop him, but I failed you." Her anger flared, but beneath it was a spark of clarity. The battle ahead wasn't just about custody, it was about unmasking Daniel's lies. The argument erupted. Sarah's voice rose, "You left me when I needed you most." David's hands trembled as he said, "I thought distance would keep you safe." The narrator described the air heavy with grief, the clash of guilt and hurt years in the making. Ethan wandered in, rubbing his eyes, whispering, "Mom, who is he?" Sarah's chest tightened as she pulled him close, whispering, "This is your uncle." The word felt foreign on her tongue, carrying both bitterness and fragile hope. For the first time, Ethan looked at David with innocent curiosity, unaware of the storm between them. After Ethan returned to bed, Sarah and David sat in silence, the storm outside beginning to ease. David finally whispered, "I'll stand with you in this fight, if you'll let me." Sarah's eyes brimmed with tears, her voice low. "I don't know if I can trust you, but I don't want to face this alone." The narrator explained how, in that moment, broken family ties began to stitch themselves into fragile threads of alliance. The risk was immense, but Sarah realized help sometimes came in the form of painful reconciliation. She exhaled slowly, feeling the weight shift just enough to breathe again. The courthouse loomed tall against the gray morning sky, its stone walls cold and unyielding. Sarah clutched Ethan's small hand before leading him inside, her heart racing. The narrator explained how each step echoed like the march of destiny. Daniel waited at the entrance with his lawyer, his smirk sharp as a blade. Ethan whispered, "Mom, I'm scared." Sarah knelt, pressing his shoulders gently, whispering, "I'm here always." Her own fear pressed down like chains, but her voice stayed steady. In that moment, she wasn't just a mother walking into court. She was a warrior stepping onto a battlefield where the future of her child hung in balance. Inside the courtroom, silence carried the weight of judgment. Sarah sat beside her lawyer, fingers gripping the table edge. Daniel's lawyer spoke first, painting her as unstable and overworked. Daniel nodded along with false sincerity, his eyes flicking towards Sarah with venom. The narrator revealed how each word cut her deeper, the lies stacking like bricks against her. When her lawyer finally rose, Sarah straightened her back, drawing breath, as though every piece of her resolve had gathered for this moment. She whispered to herself, "For Ethan," as the truth waited to be spoken. Sarah took the stand, her palms sweating as she faced the judge. She spoke of nights working double shifts, mornings walking Ethan to school, and sacrifices made quietly. Tears shimmered, but her voice grew stronger with each word. Daniel interrupted, shouting accusations, only to be silenced by the gavel's sharp crack. The narrator explained how Sarah's truth, raw and unpolished, pierced through the courtroom's sterile air. She ended with, "I've given everything to protect my son, and I will not stop now." In that moment, the weight of her life became her weapon, and her love her shield. David entered the courtroom carrying documents, his presence a ripple through the silence. He presented proof of Daniel's hidden finances, exposing years of deceit. Gasps filled the room as the evidence was laid bare. Daniel's face reddened, his composure cracking under the weight of truth. Sarah turned toward her brother, her eyes softening with gratitude, though trust was still fragile. The narrator explained how betrayal met redemption in one moment, shifting the balance of the trial. The truth, long buried, now stood unshakable in the light. For the first time in weeks, Sarah's heart lifted with fragile hope. The climax erupted as Daniel lost control, shouting accusations that echoed across the courtroom. His mask shattered, revealing the bitterness he tried to hide. The judge's gavel struck with finality, silencing the chaos. The narrator explained how Sarah, though shaken, felt a surge of strength. She reached for Ethan, whispering, "We're going to be okay." Tears streamed as the verdict neared, yet her heart no longer feared. She had faced her past, her oppressor, and her own doubts. The courtroom was not just a legal battleground, it was the place where Sarah reclaimed her voice and her power. The verdict was read, Sarah's chest rising as the words settled, "Full custody granted." The narrator explained how relief washed through her like a wave, yet its undertow carried pain from the battles fought. Daniel sat in silence, his anger muted by defeat. Sarah reached for Ethan's hand, whispering, "We did it." His small smile broke through her tears. Victory had come, but not without scars etched deep into her spirit. The courtroom emptied, leaving echoes of struggle and sacrifice behind. For Sarah, it was more than winning custody. It was reclaiming the voice she thought she had lost. Back at the apartment, Sarah placed the custody papers in a drawer, closing it with finality. The narrator described the silence that followed, not heavy but freeing, like chains finally unfastened. Ethan ran to her, arms wrapping around her waist. "We're safe now, right, Mom?" he asked with wide, hopeful eyes. Sarah kissed the top of his head and whispered, "Yes, we're safe." Yet she knew safety was not the end, only the beginning of rebuilding what had been broken. Still, for the first time in years, hope didn't feel like a lie. That evening, Sarah cooked dinner, the sound of sizzling filling the kitchen. Ethan sat at the table drawing, his crayons scattering across the surface. The narrator explained how ordinary moments had become extraordinary treasures after all they endured. Sarah smiled at Ethan's laughter, soft and genuine, echoing against walls that once held fear. She said, "This feels like home again." For the first time in a long time, joy was not borrowed, but earned. The scent of food, the warmth of light, and the sound of Ethan's giggles wrapped Sarah in the promise of healing. Later, Sarah stood at the window, watching city lights flicker against the night. The narrator described how the world beyond still carried threats and uncertainties, but inside she felt stronger. David had called earlier, offering to help more. And though trust would take time, she felt less alone. Sarah whispered to herself, "We're going to be okay," her reflection staring back not with fear but quiet determination. Ethan's laughter drifted from the bedroom, filling the silence with hope. The wounds were deep, but healing had begun. The final night closed quietly. Sarah peeked into Ethan's room, watching him sleep peacefully under the soft glow of a nightlight. She placed a hand on the doorframe, whispering, "We're stronger now, and we'll never stop fighting." The narrator explained how the fight had changed her. Scars remained, but they were proof of survival, not weakness. She lay down beside Ethan, a real smile spreading across her face, unmasked and free. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, uncertainty felt like possibility, not fear. Together they had endured, and together they would rebuild.